Hey guys, this is CrankyDroogs.
I'm Tiger Turtle.
And I'm Lobster Wizard. Hope you enjoy.
Absolutely. Today we're doing another COD video, and we're talking about the World Cup in Brazil.
But we're not talking about the football side. We're raising some interesting points about it that have more to do with the social impact that you guys might be interested in.
And we're going to try really hard not to be preachy, because that really isn't our intention. We just want to raise some social issues.
Just spark some thought in you guys. We're not looking to shove anything down your throat or anything like that.
We're not trying to make any points. We're just trying to make interesting content that hopefully you can enjoy.
Indeed.
It's obviously the main argument that comes with the World Cup is, and that the Brazilians themselves have been arguing, is that it's inherently a poor country. Although the economy is actually huge in itself, most of the population don't really see any benefit.
So the amazing statistic about, well, there's a couple, but one of which is that
the bottom 10% of all the people that live in the country, which is roughly 12 million odd people, control about 1.2% of Brazil's GDP.
And that's really low. That's
obscenely low.
That shows how poor the poorest in the country are.
Considering this is the sixth largest economy in the world.
Indeed.
And actually, in terms of the wealthy people, with the top 10% owning about 40% of the economy, which isn't dissimilar to, countries like Britain, and actually better than countries like the US, is actually astounding how poor the poorest are. The contrast is almost unbelievable.
Indeed. And so the problem really here is that, so they have a situation where there is a huge amount of poverty, and then they spend, how much did they spend on the
14 billion? I mean, it contrasts, but 12 to 14
so they
billion
spent about 12 to 14 billion
dollars.
It's
all done on US dollars.
Sure. On the World Cup, when they could have used that money to combat poverty, to make social schemes, fund education, all that kind of thing.
Education is one of the biggest things in Brazil in terms of the poorest just don't have access to.
Exactly.
And it's not advertised like it is in Africa and in India and places like that. It's just not as well known that the people that live in the famous favelas, as you will know from playing COD, just have they just have access to no opportunities whatsoever.
Indeed. So that's the general complaint. There have been protests about this, and largely these protests don't go down very well in Brazil.
No.
But that's a different story.
The police tend to be rather heavy-handed.
Yes,
but
indeed.
Again, as you said. And so obviously the argument really here is, will the World Cup actually benefit the Brazilian economy?
Which, if it does, then one could make the argument that will trickle down to the poorest in the country, and they will actually benefit in the long run because there'll be a growth in infrastructure and in business and employment, etc., 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 where that will lift the poorest out of poverty, and hence spending that money will help the poorest.
So over the next 10 years, the idea is that although World Cup generates a certain amount of income for the country, it is short-term income. It's not going to benefit it over the next 100 years, but it will impact it for the next 10 years.
The general consensus is that the benefits won't be quite as big as they'd hoped, and not as big as certainly as.
Although in money terms,
the
money terms is actually rather large. It will be tenfold the actual initial investment
over the period of 10 years.
Over the period of 10 years, but the difference being really that again the poorest in society won't see any of that unless the government drastically changes its social policy in terms of looking at how they want to spend that money.
And of course there is a social side to consider in that, hosting a World Cup, well, it will instill a very
massive national pride,
a massive amount of national pride.
If they win, that'll be.
If they win, that'll be great.
I mean, they estimated, and whether it's true or not because it's impossible to tell, but for every goal that England scored, they were saying it was going to bring about £100 million worth of economic benefit.
Really?
To the country, in terms of
that's
people
amazing.
Buying footballs and shirts and spending money in the pub and all these kind of things.
These are good for the economy.
Obviously, England is a very wealthy nation in comparison. In terms of most people have a considerably higher percentage of the wealth.
Of course, yes.
And have
it's
more
much
disposable
easier
income, etc.
for a benefit to
spread. But I mean, if that works in anywhere near in relation to Brazil, and they're obviously performing better than we are already, they've scored far more goals than we have. And actually, if that can continue, and they could potentially go on to win the World Cup, then that could potentially be massive and have far unforeseen consequences that weren't originally thought of.
However, there is another social point to make that I think is very interesting, in that it could be said that things like the World Cup are a distraction for the masses to forget about such social issues as mass poverty.
And the other thing that you've got to consider with this, and yes, I would completely agree, but they also came out and said at the start of the World Cup that the average ticket price, which didn't seem particularly expensive by anybody's standards, would cost the average person, and I mean obviously the average person is going to be a lot better off than the poorest, would cost them half a month's wage for a ticket to any game.
Right.
So what we're saying here is, yes, it may be a distraction if you're watching it on telly or talking about it, but the average Brazilian will never get to see a game.
It's not the seeing a game. It's the fact that these things exist and take a lot of people's attention. It means that essentially what happens is that people cease to care about inequality and just care about whether Brazil will win the World Cup. And this isn't necessarily just related to Brazil in itself. The same happens in the UK. People switch off on political issues. All anyone cares about now is whether, well, I mean, obviously England are out, but at the time, all anyone cared about was how far England are going to go. And now all anyone cares about really is what's next for the England team. It'll be a while before it dies down. In this period, people switch off on social issues that perhaps they shouldn't do.
Although, as I said before, clearly some people aren't, as you would expect.
Well, you could definitely say that.
It's hard to tell.
The poor
we're
definitely,
not in Brazil.
Indeed, and you'd think that the poorest of Brazil won't ignore it.
And more to the point, maybe the poorest won't ignore it, but they clearly don't have the ability, the funds, or perhaps even the education to realistically challenge anything that's going on in Brazil. So,
true.
Can they do it anyway?
But it's certainly a distraction for the rest of the population to neatly forget about it. You could argue. I don't. I'm undecided on that point, basically. Well, I'm undecided on that point in its entirety. But I think it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
So anyway, to finish, we hope that you've either enjoyed it or liked it or learned something. And if you have your own personal opinion, then obviously feel free to leave it if you agree or disagree with what we've said.
Or if you think we've just talked a load of bullshit.
Yep, then absolutely feel free to leave it. Hope you like what we've actually put together. Thanks for watching. Please feel free to like, comment and subscribe.
And we hope to see you again.